good evening, and welcome. Welcome to a quiet place at the edge of the world, where the day you have carried for so many hours is finally allowed to set itself down. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day it has been, you have arrived here, and that is enough. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. Nothing to solve. Nothing to remember. The only task before you now is the gentlest one there is, which is to let go. Slowly, softly, one small breath at a time. So take a moment before we begin to make yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillow if you need to. Pull the blanket a little higher, or let your arms rest loosely at your sides. Feel the weight of your own body pressing down into the mattress, that good and heavy feeling of being held by something soft. Let your shoulders come down, away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench. Let the small muscles around your eyes grow still and easy. You do not need to keep your eyes open for any of this. In fact, whenever you feel ready, you may close them, and simply listen. And let my voice be a low and steady thing in the dark, like a warm current carrying you somewhere far away. And before we set out, let us take just a few slow breaths together to help your body understand that the day is truly over now, that it is time to rest. There is nothing you must do to fall asleep. Sleep comes on its own, softly, when we simply stop holding on. So breathe in now, gently, slowly, through your nose, drawing the cool air down into your chest, unhurried, and then let it go again, slowly, softly, feeling your body grow a little heavier, a little more still as the breath flows out. And again, breathe in, slow and deep and easy, and let it fill you. And then release it, and with it release the small tensions of the day, the little worries, the things left undone, all of it, just for now, set gently aside. And once more, breathe in the quiet of the night, and breathe out the last of the day, and feel how with each slow breath you sink a little deeper into the warmth of the bed, a little closer to sleep. There, that is all. You need not think about your breathing any more now. Let it find its own slow rhythm, and let it carry you, like the river carries a small boat, gently downstream, toward sleep. Tonight you are going to drift back in time. Not a few years, not a few centuries, but thousands upon thousands of years back to the very dawn of what we call civilization, to a long green ribbon of life winding through an endless desert, to the banks of a great and patient river called the Nile. Tonight, you will fall asleep to the entire story of ancient Egypt, the civilization that refused to die. And it is a long story, an old story, one that unfolds across more time than almost any other story humans have ever told. There is no hurry in it. There are no sudden turns to startle you. There is only the slow, unbroken flow of the river and the rise and fall of kingdoms, and the soft accumulation of centuries settling like fine sand, layer upon layer, until you drift off somewhere along the way, and that is exactly as it should be. Let me tell you where we are going, so that you can begin to picture it. Imagine, if you will, a land of two colours. There is the black land, and there is the red land. The black land is the narrow strip of dark, rich soil that lies along the river. Soil made from silt, from the mud that the Nile lays down each year like a gift. It is soft and fertile and dark as coffee, and out of it grows everything green, everything living, the wheat and the barley, the papyrus reeds, the date palms heavy with fruit, and then, on either side of that thin green thread, there is the red land, the desert, stretching away to the horizon in every direction, dry and gold and silent, rising into cliffs and dunes that shimmer in the heat. Between these two worlds, the living green and the endless gold, the entire drama of ancient Egypt will play itself out. And it all begins, as everything in Egypt begins, with the river. So come with me now, all the way back, to a time before there were pharaohs, before there were pyramids, before anyone had ever carved a single hieroglyph into stone. Let the years fall away like leaves. 10,000 years ago, the world is younger and wetter than the one you know. The great Sahara Desert that we picture today, that vast ocean of sand, is not yet a desert at all. It is a green and rolling savanna, dotted with lakes and grasslands, where herds of cattle graze and hunters follow the rains. Small bands of people move across this landscape, and they paint pictures on the rocks of the animals they see, giraffes and elephants and cattle, and they leave those paintings there for us to find. Thousands of years later, the very first whispers of the people who would one day become the Egyptians. But the world is slowly changing. The rains that fed the green savanna begin, over many centuries, to fail. The grasslands dry. The lakes shrink and vanish. The desert begins its long, patient advance, and the people who lived scattered across that wide land are pushed, gently, generation by generation, toward the one place that never dries, the one reliable source of water in all that growing wilderness. They are drawn, like water itself, toward the river. And what a river it is! Picture it now in your mind. This Nile, the longest river in the world, flowing not the way you might expect, but from south to north, drawing its waters from the far-off highlands and the great lakes deep in the heart of Africa, gathering strength as it travels thousands of miles through jungle and swamp and rock, until at last it enters the long, narrow valley that will become Egypt. And here, once a year, every year, the river performs its miracle. Fed by summer rains falling far to the south, in mountains no Egyptian would ever see, the Nile begins to swell. It rises and rises, spilling over its banks, spreading out across the flat land of the valley floor, drowning the fields under a warm and shallow flood, and then, slowly over the following weeks, it recedes again, and as it withdraws it leaves behind that gift, that fresh new layer of black, fertile silt, ready for planting. Year after year, without fail, the river floods and gives and withdraws, and in that gentle, dependable rhythm the people find something they can trust. They find something they can build a life around. They find, in a world of drying grass and advancing sand, a promise that is always kept. So they settle. Along the black land, in the mud beside the water, small villages begin to appear. Round huts of reed and mud brick, little plots of grain, pens for goats and cattle. The people learn to plant their seed in the fresh silt after the flood, and to harvest before the next flood comes. And slowly, over many generations, they learn the deep art of farming a river valley. This is a slow story. Remember, there is no single morning when everything changes. There are only thousands of quiet mornings, each one much like the last, the sun rising over the eastern cliffs, the mist lifting off the water, a woman grinding grain, a man mending a net, a child chasing a bird along the muddy bank. 10,000 mornings. 100,000. And with each one, the villagers grow a little larger, a little more settled, a little more sure of themselves. Let yourself sink into that picture for a while. The warmth of the early sun, the smell of the river, that green and muddy smell of reeds and wet earth and slow-moving water, the soft lowing of cattle, the murmur of voices in a language no one now alive can speak. There is time here. There is so much time. Nothing is rushed. The river will flood again next year as it did last year, as it always has. And the people plant and harvest and are born and grow old and die, and the villagers remain, passing themselves down like a story told from parent to child across the long, unhurried centuries. Let me linger here with you a while longer, in these earliest days, before the kings and the crowns, before the pyramids and the temples, in the quiet time when Egypt was only villages beside the water. For there is something very peaceful about this beginning, and it will do you good to rest in it as the night settles down around you. Picture the world of these first river people. They knew nothing of the great things that would one day rise along their river. They knew only the river itself, and the seasons of the river, and the small round of their own lives. And yet already, in these earliest times, they were becoming, without knowing it, the people they would one day be. Already they were learning the things that would define them forever after. They were learning, for instance, to look at the stars. For a farming people who lived and died by the flood, nothing mattered more than knowing when the flood would come, and the ancient Egyptians discovered, over many watchful generations, that the great flood of the Nile arrived each year at almost exactly the same time that a certain brilliant star, the brightest star in all the night sky, first rose again in the dawn after being hidden for a season. We call that star Sirius, the dog star. And the Egyptians watched for its return, that first faint gleam low on the eastern horizon just before dawn, and when they saw it, they knew the flood was coming, and by this they measured out their year, and built one of the very first calendars in the history of the world, a calendar of 365 days, remarkably close to the true length of the year, worked out by patient watchers of the sky thousands and thousands of years ago, lying on their rooftops in the warm dark, gazing up, waiting for the star. And they were learning to make things, these early people, learning crafts that they would perfect over the coming ages. They learned to shape clay into pottery, and to fire it, and to decorate it with lovely patterns, ripples of water and images of boats and animals. They learnt to weave linen from the flax that grew in their fields, spinning the fine thread and weaving it into cloth so fine and so white that it would clothe the whole civilization for 4,000 years. From the humblest farmer to the greatest pharaoh, cool white linen against the heat. They learned to carve stone and to work with copper, hammering and shaping the soft red metal into tools and ornaments. They learned to build boats, first of bundled papyrus reeds, light and simple, and later of wood, and with these boats they travelled up and down their great river highway. For the Nile was not only the source of life, but also the great road that connected the whole land, carrying people and goods and news along its length, the current bearing you gently northward toward the sea, and the steady north wind filling your sail to carry you southward against the current, so that the river served in both directions, an effortless highway given free by nature. And already, in these early times, they were beginning to imagine the gods, and to wonder about death, and to hope for something beyond it. Even in the very oldest graves, from before the kingdom, before the pharaohs, we find that these early people buried their dead with care, laying them to rest curled on their sides as if sleeping, and placing beside them pots of food and drink, and beads and small treasured things, for the journey ahead, for the life they hoped would come after. Even then, at the very dawn of everything, before there were words to write it down, the Egyptians were already reaching, already hoping, already refusing to believe that death was simply an ending. That hope was there from the very beginning, in the oldest graves in the sand, and it would grow and deepen across the thousands of years until it became the great pyramids and the golden masks and the whole magnificent architecture of Egyptian eternity. But it began here, small and tender, a pot of food and a string of beads laid beside a sleeping figure in a simple grave beside the river. Rest in that thought a while. These gentle, hopeful, hard-working people, so long ago, watching the stars, weaving their linen, shaping their pots, sailing their reed boats along the shining river, burying their dead with tenderness and hope. Everything that Egypt would become was already there, in seed, in these quiet villages, and the river flowed on, and the seasons turned, and slowly, slowly, out of all these small beginnings, a great civilization was being born. Now let the years drift forward again. The villages have been growing for a very long time now, and something is beginning to happen among them. They are beginning to draw together. A village that farms well and grows large begins to have more than it needs. It begins to trade with its neighbours, exchanging grain for pottery, cattle for tools, fish for flax. And with trade comes contact, and with contact comes the slow knitting together of many small communities into larger ones. Villages become towns. Towns come to be ruled by chiefs, by leaders who can organise the digging of canals to carry the floodwater further, who can settle disputes, who can command the labour of many hands. And these chiefdoms, over centuries, begin to gather into two great kingdoms, one in the south and one in the north. In the south, in the long narrow valley where the river runs between its cliffs, there is the kingdom we call Upper Egypt. It is called Upper because it lies upstream, higher along the river's course, even though on a map it sits at the bottom. Its symbol is a tall white crown, shaped a little like a bowling pin, and its patron is a vulture goddess who spreads her wings over the land. And in the north, where the river fans out into that wide, marshy, many-branched delta before it meets the sea, there is the kingdom we call Lower Egypt, downstream, lower along the river's course. Its symbol is a red crown, low and flat with a tall curl rising from the back, and its protector is a cobra goddess, rearing and watchful. Two lands, then, the white crown and the red crown, the vulture and the cobra, the narrow valley and the spreading delta. For a long time they exist side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes quarrelling, each with its own kings and its own gods and its own way of doing things. But it could not last forever, this division. Somewhere in the mists at the very beginning of recorded history, more than 5,000 years ago, a king of the south, a king of Upper Egypt, set out to do something that no one had done before. He set out to bind the two lands together into one. We do not know his true story. Not really. It is so old that it has half dissolved into legend. But the Egyptians remembered him, and they gave him a name, and the name they most often gave him was Narmer, or sometimes Menes, the one who joined the two lands. And there survives, from that impossibly distant time, a single object that seems to whisper of what he did. It is a flat piece of carved stone, a ceremonial palette, dark green and polished smooth, and on it, in careful raised carving, a king is shown wearing the white crown of the south, raising a mace to strike down an enemy. And on the other side, the same king wears the red crown of the north, walking in triumph. The white crown and the red crown, on the two faces of a single stone. Whatever truly happened in those years, the Egyptians would remember it forever, as the moment their world began, the moment the two lands became one land, ruled by one king who wore, from then on, a double crown, the white nested inside the red, the vulture and the cobra together upon his brow. And so, with the joining of the two lands, the long story of Egypt as a kingdom truly begins. Let that thought settle over you gently. One river, two crowns, one king. And ahead of them, though none of them could know it, more than 3,000 years of history, longer than the time that separates you from that first king, would stretch again into the future. An unbroken thread of pharaohs and gods and pyramids and temples, rising and falling and rising again, the civilization that simply refused to die. Are you comfortable? Is the blanket warm? There is no need to follow every name, no need to hold on to every detail. Let the story wash over you like the flood over the fields. If your thoughts drift, let them drift. If your eyes have already closed, let them stay closed. I will keep speaking, softly, and the river will keep flowing, and we will move together, slowly, down the long stream of the centuries. Now, in these earliest days of the United Kingdom, the kings built themselves a home. They needed a place from which to rule both lands, a place that sat right at the seam where the narrow valley of the south met the wide delta of the north. And there, at that meeting point, they founded a city. Its walls were whitewashed and gleaming, and so it came to be called the White Walls, though later ages would know it by a different name, Memphis. And Memphis would remain for centuries the great capital of Egypt, the seat of kings, a bustling city of temples and workshops and palaces, sitting like a knot in the ribbon of the river, tying the two lands together. Imagine this early Memphis for a moment, the white walls rising from the green fields. Inside, the crowded lanes, the smell of baking bread and brewing beer, the clatter of the coppersmiths, the shouts of the market, boats crowding the quays, unloading grain and stone and cattle and pottery, priests moving in slow procession toward the temples, their heads shaved smooth, their linen robes very white in the sun. And somewhere at the heart of it all, in the cool shadowed rooms of the palace, the king, the living link between the people and the gods, the one whose very existence held the world together. For that is what the king was, to the Egyptians. He was not merely a ruler, he was not merely the strongest chief or the wealthiest lord. He was something far greater and stranger than that. He was the point where the human world touched the divine. The Egyptians believed that the whole order of the universe, the rising of the sun, the flooding of the river, the turning of the seasons, the very existence of life against the endless red desert of death, all of it depended on the king performing his sacred role. They had a word for this order, this rightness, this cosmic balance. They called it Ma'at, and they pictured her as a goddess with a single feather in her hair, the feather of truth, and it was the king's highest duty, above all others, to uphold Ma'at, to keep the world in balance, to hold back the ever-present forces of chaos and disorder that pressed in at the edges of everything. As long as the king did his part, the sun would rise, and the river would flood, and Egypt would live. That was the bargain at the heart of the whole civilization, and it would hold, in one form or another, for 3,000 years. Now let us drift forward again, past the very first kings, whose names survive only as scratches on old jars and fragments of ivory, into the age when Egypt first truly found its greatness. Historians divide the long story of Egypt into great chapters, and they call the first of the truly grand ones the Old Kingdom. This is the age of the pyramid builders. This is the age when Egypt, young and confident and rich beyond measure, reached up toward the heavens and built the most enormous things that human beings had ever built. Things so vast and so enduring that they still stand today, 45 centuries later, the last survivors of all the wonders of the ancient world. But it did not begin with the great pyramids all at once. Nothing in Egypt begins all at once. It began, as so much did, with a single remarkable man, a man who was not a king at all, but who served one. His name was Imhotep, and he was, we might say, the first architect and engineer whose name we know from all of history. He served a king named Djoser, and Imhotep was that rare kind of mind that looks at the way things have always been done and quietly imagines them done differently, done bigger, done in a way no one had dared before. In those days, when a king died, he was buried beneath a low, flat, rectangular tomb of mud brick, a structure we call a mastaba, which means bench, because that is rather what it looked like, a great low bench sitting over the burial chamber. And Imhotep, planning the tomb of his king Djoser, had an idea. What if, instead of one mastaba, he built one atop another, each a little smaller than the one below, rising in steps toward the sky? And what if he built them not of humble mud brick, which crumbles, but of stone, of cut and dressed limestone, which lasts? And so, at a place called Saqqara, on the edge of the desert overlooking Memphis, Imhotep built the Step Pyramid, 6 great stone terraces rising more than 200 feet into the desert air. The first large stone building in the history of the world, a stairway for a dead king to climb up into the company of the stars. Picture it rising there against the pale sky. Gangs of workers, thousands of them, hauling the pale limestone, blocks up long ramps of packed earth. The rasp of copper chisels on stone, the chanting of the work songs that kept the great teams pulling in rhythm, the dust hanging golden in the heat. And slowly, over years, the terraces climbing higher, step by step, until the thing stood finished, gleaming white, a mountain made by human hands where before there had been only flat desert. The people who saw it must have felt something we can barely imagine, the astonishment of witnessing, for the very first time, what their own civilization was capable of. Nothing so large had ever existed. Nothing made by people had ever reached so high. And once the idea had been born, it grew. Later, kings wanted more. They wanted not steps but smooth, soaring sides, true pyramids, and their builders learned, through trial, and sometimes through failure, how to make them. There was a king named Sneferu, who was, in his way, the greatest pyramid builder of all, for he built not one but three, learning as he went. His first attempt began too steep, and part way up the builders realized that the angle was dangerous, that the whole vast structure might collapse under its own weight. And so they changed the angle halfway, and the pyramid rises steeply, and then, abruptly, bends to a gentler slope near the top. We call it the Bent Pyramid, and it stands still, a monument not to triumph, but to learning, to the moment when ancient engineers looked at their own work and understood, with a chill, that they had to change course. And then Sneferu built again, correctly this time, and raised the first true smooth-sided pyramid, glowing red in the desert light, the shape that would define Egypt forever after. But it was Sneferu's son who would build the greatest of them all. His name was Khufu, and on a rocky plateau called Giza, just across the river from where modern Cairo now stands, he raised the Great Pyramid, the largest stone structure ever built by human hands, and the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that still survives to be seen today. Let me try to help you feel how enormous it is as you lie there, drifting. Imagine over 2 million blocks of stone, each one on average as heavy as a large car, some of them far heavier, weighing as much as a small house. Imagine those blocks stacked into a perfect pyramid rising nearly 500 feet into the air, so tall that, for nearly 4,000 years, until the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, it remained the tallest building on the entire earth. Imagine its base so wide and so precisely level that even today, with all our modern instruments, we can barely find the tiny errors in it. Imagine its 4 sides aligned almost perfectly to the 4 directions, north, south, east and west, by people who had no compasses, only the stars. And imagine that when it was new, it was not the bare, stepped, sandy brown structure you may have seen in photographs. It was cased entirely in polished white limestone, smooth as glass, so that it shone in the sun like a beacon, a blazing white mountain visible for miles across the valley, its capstone perhaps sheathed in gold catching the first light of dawn. How was it built? For a long time people imagined it must have been the work of slaves, whipped and driven, dying in their thousands. But that is not the picture that the evidence gives us. Near the pyramids, archaeologists have found the town where the workers lived, and their bakeries, and the bones of the great quantities of cattle and fish and bread that fed them, and even the graves of workers who died and were buried there with honour, close to the king they served. These were not slaves. They were Egyptians, skilled crews of quarrymen and stonemasons and haulers, organised into teams with proud names, working in shifts, well fed, well housed, doing their duty to the king and to the gods, and to the great work of keeping Ma'at, keeping the order of the world. Many of them were farmers who came to work on the pyramid during the season of the flood, when the fields were under water and there was no farming to be done, earning their bread by lending their strength to the mountain of the king. It was, in its way, one of the greatest collective achievements in all of human history. Not the work of one tyrant, but the work of a whole people, pulling together generation after generation. Let yourself stand, in your imagination, at the foot of the Great Pyramid on a morning long ago, while it was being built, and simply take it in. Feel the warmth of the early sun already gathering strength. Smell the dust, the fine pale limestone dust that hangs golden in the air, and the smell of the river not far off, and the smell of bread baking in the great ovens of the workers' town, where thousands of loaves are made each day to feed the crews. Hear the sounds all around you, the rhythmic rasp and tap of copper chisels on stone, the creak of the wooden sledges dragging the great blocks up the long ramps of packed earth and rubble, the calls of the overseers. And above all the deep, steady chant of the hauling teams, hundreds of men pulling together on the ropes, their song keeping them all in time, heave and rest, and heave and rest, the great block inching forward a little with each pull. See the ramps rising against the growing mountain of stone, the teams of workers moving up and down them like lines of ants, tiny against the vastness of the thing they are raising, See the water carriers bringing jars from the river, and the men pouring water on the ramp before the sledges to make the great blocks slide more easily. A simple trick that made the impossible possible. And see, above it all, the pyramid itself, already so huge, its pale sides climbing toward the deep blue sky, growing, course by course, block by block, year by year, the greatest thing that human hands had ever made, rising slowly out of the desert by the patient labour of a whole people. It is a magnificent thing to picture, and a strangely peaceful one too, all that vast effort moving in its slow, steady rhythm. The chant of the haulers rising and falling like the breathing of the whole civilization, patient and unhurried and sure. And why? Why build such a thing at all? Here we come to the deepest heart of the Egyptian soul, to the thing they cared about above almost all else, which was the conquest of death. The Egyptians loved life. They loved this world, the green fields, the good bread, the cool beer, the warmth of the sun, the company of family, the whole rich abundance of living beside their generous river. They loved it so much that they could not bear the thought of losing it, and so they built their entire civilization around a single, stubborn, magnificent hope. The hope that death was not an ending, but a doorway, that a person could pass through it and come out on the other side into a life very much like this one, only better, an eternal Egypt where the fields were always green and the harvest never failed and the beloved dead lived on forever. But to make that passage, they believed certain things were needed. The body itself had to be preserved, for the spirit needed a home to return to. And so, over the centuries, the Egyptians developed the strange and painstaking art of mummification, the careful preservation of the dead. Let me tell it to you gently, for it is really an act of love, however strange it may sound. When a person of means died, their body was taken to the embalmers, who worked in the shadowed rooms of the House of Purification over many days, 70 days in all, for the grandest burials. The organs that would spoil were carefully removed and preserved separately in special jars, each watched over by a protective god. The body was then packed and covered in a natural salt drawn from the desert, and left for many weeks until every trace of moisture had been drawn out of it, until it was dry and light and would not decay. And then it was anointed with fragrant oils and resins, and wrapped, round and round, in hundreds of yards of fine linen, layer upon layer, with small protective charms and amulets tucked between the folds, and a mask placed over the face, so that the spirit would know its home when it returned. And through all of this the priests spoke the ancient words, the spells and prayers that would guide and protect the dead one on the long journey ahead. And there was a journey ahead, in the Egyptian imagination, a journey through the shadowed land of the dead, a perilous crossing full of gates and guardians and dangers, at the end of which the dead person would come at last into a great hall, the Hall of Two Truths, to stand before the throne of Osiris, the green-skinned god of the dead and of resurrection. And there, in that hall, the most important moment of all would take place, the weighing of the heart. For the Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of a person's character, the record of everything they had done, and in the presence of the gods that heart would be placed upon a great golden scale, and in the other pan would be placed the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and rightness and balance. And if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, weighed down by cruelty and lies and injustice, it would sink, and the person would be devoured by a waiting monster, and would cease to exist forever. But if the heart was light as the feather, if the person had lived a good and just and balanced life, then the scale would hang even, and the god would nod, and the dead one would be welcomed into the eternal fields, to live forever in the presence of the gods. It was, in the end, a moral vision as much as a magical one. Live well, live justly, live in balance and truth, and you will not fear the weighing of your heart. Let that image stay with you a moment, softly, as you drift. The golden scale. The single white feather, the quiet, patient judgment, not of vengeance but of balance. It is a beautiful thing to think about as sleep comes near, that an ancient people, 4,000 years ago, dreamed that the measure of a life was whether the heart was light. Now, before we drift onward down the river of the centuries, let us pause here, in the age of the pyramids, and let me tell you a little of how the people of Egypt actually lived, day by day, in those long ago years. For the pharaohs and the pyramids and the gods are only part of the story. Beneath them, always, ran the quiet ordinary lives of ordinary people, millions of them, across the thousands of years. And their lives, too, are worth resting your mind upon as sleep comes near. Imagine, then, a village along the Black Land, a small cluster of houses of mud brick, sun-dried and cool inside, their walls whitewashed or sometimes painted with simple patterns. Imagine the flat roofs where people slept on the hottest nights to catch the breeze off the river, gazing up at the enormous dome of stars, the same stars that watched over the pyramids. Imagine the small courtyards where a family kept its oven, a simple dome of clay, and where bread was baked each morning. That thick, coarse, nourishing bread that was the very staff of Egyptian life, so central to their world that to be paid for one's work was, quite literally, to be paid in bread and in beer. For bread and beer were the two great staples, made both from grain, the one baked and the other brewed, and both of them thick and hearty and filling, more like a food than a drink, the beer of the Egyptians, cloudy and mild and sweet, drunk by everyone, by children and workers and priests and kings alike. Imagine the morning in such a village. The first pale light coming up over the eastern cliffs, turning the river from black to silver to gold, the cool air before the great heat of the day settles in, the lowing of cattle being driven out to pasture along the green margin of the fields, the creak and splash of the water being lifted from the river or the canals, poured out along the little channels to feed the crops, a man walking out to his fields with his hoe over his shoulder, a woman kneeling at her grindstone, rolling the heavy stone back and forth, grinding the grain into flour. That patient, rhythmic, endless work that filled the mornings of Egyptian women for 4,000 years. Children running along the paths between the fields, chasing each other, chasing the birds that came to steal the grain. Fishermen out on the water in their light boats of bundled papyrus reed, casting their nets, or standing in the shallows with their spears, for the river teemed with fish, and fish was food for rich and poor alike. And the fields themselves, oh, the fields were the heart of everything. Picture them stretching away from the river in a broad green band, the wheat and the barley rippling in the breeze, and among them the vegetable plots, the onions and the garlic and the leeks and the lettuces and the beans, and the vineyards where grapes grew heavy for the wine that the wealthy loved, and the groves of date palms and fig trees and pomegranates, and the tall stands of papyrus in the marshes at the water's edge. That remarkable plant from which the Egyptians made so many things, above all the smooth, pale sheets of papyrus paper on which they wrote, cutting the stems into strips and pressing them together into the very first paper the world had ever known. All of this the good river gave, year after year, and the people worked it, and harvested it, and stored it, and lived by it, and the great cycle of the farming year turned as steadily as the flood itself. For the Egyptians divided their year into 3 great seasons, and all 3 were named for the river. There was the season of the flood, when the waters rose and covered the fields, and there was little farming to be done, and it was then that the great works of the kings were built, the pyramids and the temples, by the farmers whose fields lay drowned. Then there was the season of the emergence, when the waters withdrew and the black fresh silt lay ready, and the people went out to plough and to sow, scattering the seed and driving flocks of animals across the fields to press it down into the soft mud. And then there was the season of the harvest, the dry season, when the grain ripened golden under the fierce sun, and the people went out with their sickles to reap it, gathering it in, threshing it, winnowing it, storing it in the great granaries against the year to come. Flood and emergence and harvest. Around and around, year after year, for thousands of years, the same slow certain wheel, as dependable as the rising of the sun. There is something deeply restful in that, is there not? To think of a people who lived so close to the rhythm of the earth and the water, who trusted the great cycle so completely, whose whole lives moved in time with the breathing of the river. And the homes of these people, let me take you inside one for a moment. The house of an ordinary family was simple, a few rooms of mud brick, cool and dim and shadowed against the heat. There would be little furniture, perhaps some low stools and a table, some woven mats and baskets, some pottery jars for storing grain and oil and water. The family would sleep on mats or low wooden frames, and though their lives were simple, the Egyptians loved beauty and loved comfort, and even the humble decorated their homes as they could, and wore what small ornaments they had, for they loved jewellery. All of them, rich and poor, loved beads and amulets and rings and bracelets, believing that such things were not only beautiful, but protective, guarding the wearer from harm and from the unseen dangers of the world. And they loved cleanliness too, the Egyptians, bathing often in the river or with jars of water, and rubbing their skin with fragrant oils to protect it from the fierce dry sun, and lining their eyes, both men and women, with dark green and black paints, the famous eye paint of Egypt, which was not merely for beauty but also, they believed, protected the eyes from the glare of the sun and from disease, and which gave to the painted faces of Egyptian men and women that striking, timeless look we know so well from their art. And they kept animals, and loved them. They kept cattle, and goats, and sheep, and geese, and ducks. And they kept cats. Oh, how they loved their cats! For the cat in Egypt was a treasured and even a sacred animal, honoured for its grace and its beauty, and for its usefulness in keeping the mice and the snakes away from the precious stores of grain. And a whole goddess, gentle Bastet, took the form of a cat, and cats were so beloved that when a household cat died, the family would mourn it deeply, and the beloved animal might even be mummified and buried with care, to live on in the eternal fields alongside its people. And they kept dogs too, hunting dogs and guard dogs and beloved pets, and we know the names of some of these ancient Egyptian dogs, for they were carved on the tombs of their masters, names that meant things like Brave One and Blackie and Reliable, 4,000-year-old dogs whose names still survive, remembered because they were loved. Let all of this settle gently over you now. The ordinary life of an ordinary people so very long ago, and yet so very like our own in all the ways that matter. They rose with the sun and worked and ate their bread and drank their beer. They loved their children and their animals. They wore their little ornaments and lined their eyes and kept their houses cool against the heat. They watched the river rise and fall. They were born, and they grew old, and they died, and they hoped, above all, for a peaceful passage into a green and everlasting land beyond. And across 4,000 years, generation upon generation, countless millions of them lived just such quiet lives along the banks of that patient river, and it is a soft and soothing thing to think of them all now, all those long-vanished people, sleeping at last, as you soon will, under the same wheeling stars. Let that image stay with you. The golden scale and the light feather, yes, but also the ordinary morning along the river, the smell of the baking bread, the lowing of the cattle, the children among the fields, the cat asleep in a patch of sun. This is Egypt too, and perhaps it is the truest Egypt of all. And these ordinary people, and the wise ones among them, knew far more than we sometimes imagine, for the Egyptians were great gatherers of practical knowledge, patient observers of the world, and they made discoveries and worked out arts that still amaze us. Consider their medicine, for the Egyptian physicians were famous throughout the ancient world, so famous that foreign kings would send all the way to Egypt, asking for a good doctor to be sent to their courts. And these physicians wrote down their knowledge on papyrus scrolls, some of which survive, and in them we find, alongside the prayers and the magic spells that were part of all ancient healing, a great store of genuine practical medicine. Careful descriptions of injuries and their treatments, of broken bones set and bound, of wounds cleaned and stitched and dressed with honey, which we now know truly does help to fight infection, of remedies drawn from herbs and plants, and even the beginnings of an understanding of the body and its workings. There were physicians who specialized, one who treated the eyes, another the teeth, another the belly, so that Egypt had, in a sense, its specialists, its dentists, and its eye doctors 4,000 years ago. And consider their skill in working stone, which remains to this day a genuine marvel that we do not fully understand, with tools of copper and stone and sand and endless patience, with no iron and no steel, no machines, no power but their own muscles and their own cleverness. They cut and shaped and polished the hardest stones on earth, granite and diorite, into vast statues and perfect columns and great sarcophagi so smooth and so precisely made that modern experts, with all our tools, marvel at how it was done. They quarried single blocks of stone weighing hundreds of tons and moved them for miles, and raised them upright as towering obelisks, tall tapering needles of stone pointing at the sky, their tips once sheathed in gold to catch the first light of dawn. And they surveyed and measured their land with such skill, remaking the boundaries of the fields anew each year after the flood had washed the markers away, that from this yearly labour there grew the very science of geometry, the measuring of the earth, one of the foundations of all mathematics. And consider their calendar, of which I have spoken, that calendar of 365 days, the ancestor, through the Greeks and the Romans, of the very calendar by which you count your own days today. And their skill in astronomy, mapping the stars into their own constellations, tracking the movements of the sky, orienting their pyramids and their temples with astonishing precision to the 4 directions and to the risings of certain stars. And their engineering of water, the canals and the basins and the dikes by which they spread and stored the floodwater across the land, wringing the greatest possible harvest from the river's gift. In 100 quiet, practical ways, these ancient people were far cleverer, far more skilled, far more knowing than we sometimes give them credit for, and their knowledge, passed on through the Greeks and beyond, became part of the foundation upon which our own world was slowly built. So when you picture Egypt, picture not only the pharaohs and the gods and the gold, but also the physician setting a broken arm and dressing it with honey, and the stonemason patiently polishing his granite by hand, and the surveyor stretching his measuring cord across the newly flooded fields, and the astronomer watching the stars wheel overhead in the warm dark. These too were Egypt, and it is a soothing thing, as sleep comes near, to think of all that patient human cleverness at work along the river, so very long ago, laying down, stone by stone, and observation by observation, some of the very foundations of the world you live in now. Now, the great age of the pyramid builders could not last forever, and it did not. The building of those enormous monuments was a colossal effort, and it drew year after year on the wealth and the labour of the whole land. And slowly, over generations, the power of the kings who had commanded all that wealth began to ebb. The nobles who governed the provinces on the king's behalf grew stronger and more independent, keeping more for themselves, passing their offices down to their sons. And then, it seems, the very thing that Egypt depended on most began to fail. For a run of years, perhaps many years, the great river did not rise as it should. The floods came low, or did not come at all. The black land did not receive its gift of silt. The harvests failed. Famine crept across the valley. And with the failure of the harvests came the failure of the old order. For how could the king still claim to hold the world in balance, to keep Maat, to command the river, when the river itself no longer obeyed? The central power in Memphis crumbled. Egypt broke apart into quarrelling pieces, each region fending for itself, and for a long, dark, uncertain stretch of time, perhaps a century or more, the great unified kingdom simply ceased to be. Historians call this troubled age the first intermediate period, the first great gap in the story, the first time the light of Egypt seemed to gutter and nearly go out. And here we come to the first great proof of the theme of our whole story tonight, the theme of the civilization that refused to die. For Egypt did not stay broken. Out of the confusion and the division, new strong men rose, in the south especially, in the ancient city of Thebes, far up the river. And there a line of determined rulers gathered their strength, and made war on their rivals in the north, and slowly, painfully, over years of struggle, they reunited the two lands once again. The white crown and the red crown came together again upon a single brow. Order returned. The river, in time, returned to its faithful rhythm, and Egypt rose from its own ashes, whole once more, entering the great second chapter of its history, the age we call the Middle Kingdom. Rest here a moment, in the quiet after that first great trial. Feel how the story breathes, in and out, like your own slow breathing now. A rising, and a falling, and a rising again. This is the deep rhythm of Egypt, and it is a comforting rhythm when you think about it, for it tells you that even when things fall apart, they can be made whole again, that even the darkest gap in the story is followed, in time, by a new dawn. Let me tell you a little more of this Middle Kingdom, and of the lands that lay beyond Egypt, to which its people looked with longing and with wonder, for Egypt did not stand alone in the world, and its story was always bound up with the lands around it. To the south, up the river, beyond the place where the smooth flow of the Nile was broken by the first of the great rocky rapids that the Egyptians called cataracts, there lay the land of Nubia, a golden land, quite literally golden, for it was from Nubia that Egypt drew much of the gold that made its temples and its tombs and its treasures shine. The very name of Nubia may come from the Egyptian word for gold. And so the pharaohs looked south with hungry eyes, and again across the centuries they pushed their power up the river into Nubia, building great fortresses of mud brick along the frontier, huge and frowning walls set upon the cliffs above the cataracts, to guard the trade routes and to control the flow of gold and other precious things out of the south. For out of the south, up that river highway, came not only gold but a whole stream of exotic and precious things that Egypt prized, and that make a lovely inventory to drift upon as you grow sleepy. There came ebony, the beautiful black wood, and ivory from the tusks of elephants and the skins of leopards which the priests wore across their shoulders in their sacred rituals, and ostrich feathers and ostrich eggs, and fragrant resins and incense for the temples, and rare and beautiful stones, and sometimes living animals, monkeys and baboons, and even on grand occasions, a giraffe or other wonders brought from the far interior of Africa to astonish the court. And Egyptian traders and soldiers and envoys travelled south into these lands, and southern peoples came north into Egypt, so that the two civilizations, the Egyptian and the Nubian, were forever entwined, sometimes at war, sometimes at peace, sometimes with Egypt ruling Nubia, and sometimes, as we have seen, with Nubian kings coming north to rule Egypt itself, but always connected, always trading, always bound together by the river that flowed between them, and Egypt looked outward in other directions too. To the northeast across the Sinai Desert, its expeditions went to the mines where turquoise and copper were dug, that lovely blue-green turquoise the Egyptians so loved for their jewellery. Across the sea to the north and east, Egyptian ships traded with the great ports of the Lebanese coast, and above all they sought the cedar wood of Lebanon, those tall, straight, fragrant timbers, for Egypt itself had no large trees, only the palms and the small acacias, and so the great beams and masts and coffins and doors of Egypt came, much of it, from the cedar forests far across the sea. And Egyptian goods travelled outward in return, the fine linen and the papyrus and the golden ornaments and the grain, so that Egypt sat at the centre of a great web of trade that reached out across the whole eastern Mediterranean and deep into Africa, the rich and envied heart of the ancient world. And in this Middle Kingdom age, as I have said, the Egyptians also wrote, and wrote beautifully, and left behind them a literature that we can still read today, and that reveals to us their inmost hearts. They wrote tales of adventure, like the story of a sailor shipwrecked upon a magical island ruled by a great and kindly serpent, who comforts the frightened man and sends him home laden with treasures, a story told to soothe and to reassure, 4,000 years old and still gentle to hear. They wrote wisdom, the counsels of fathers to sons, teaching how to live well and justly and prudently, how to speak with care and to listen with patience, and to treat others with kindness. Wisdom so sane and so humane that it might have been written yesterday. They wrote hymns to the gods and to the river, praising the Nile as the giver of all life. And they wrote too of sorrow and of doubt, poems in which a weary soul debates whether life is worth the living, and finds, in the end, a fragile peace. All of this survives, in fragments and in whole works, the true voice of the Middle Kingdom, thoughtful and humane and deep, speaking to us softly across 4,000 years. Rest in all of that a while, as the story breathes. The golden land to the south, and the river highway that bound it to Egypt. The ebony and the ivory and the leopard skins and the incense flowing north, and the giraffe brought to astonish the court. The cedar ships crossing the sea, the scribes writing their gentle tales and their humane wisdom. It is a rich and peaceful world to wander through, this Middle Kingdom, in the quiet space between the great age of the pyramids and the great age of empire yet to come. The Middle Kingdom was in many ways a wiser and more thoughtful age than the one before. The kings of this era were still great builders, still great rulers, but they had learned something from the long collapse. They knew now that a king could fall, that the world was fragile, that power had to be tended and not simply commanded. The literature of this age, and there was a rich literature, is full of a kind of hard-won reflection, a sense of the sorrows of the world and the duties of a wise ruler. The kings worked to bring the proud nobles of the provinces back under control. They dug great irrigation works and reclaimed marshy land for farming, turning a wide, watery basin far from the Nile into rich new fields. They pushed the borders of Egypt southward, up the river into the land of Nubia, that gold-rich country beyond the first great rapids, building mighty fortresses of mud brick to guard the frontier and the trade routes. And they gave their people a long stretch of stability and peace, a second golden age, quieter and less dazzling than the first perhaps, but deep and strong and enduring. And it was during this Middle Kingdom that a certain god rose to new heights of importance, a god whose story is perhaps the most beautiful and the most tender in all of Egyptian religion, and one worth telling to you now, softly, as the night deepens. It is the story of Osiris and Isis, of death and love and resurrection, and it lay at the very heart of everything the Egyptians believed about life beyond the grave. Long ago, the story goes, in the first days of the world when gods still walked upon the earth and ruled it as kings, there reigned a good king named Osiris. He was a gentle and wise ruler, and it was he, the Egyptians said, who first taught human beings how to farm, how to grow grain and tend the vine, how to live in peace under just laws instead of wandering in savagery. And Egypt flourished under his reign, and the people loved him. And beside him ruled his queen, who was also his sister and his beloved, the goddess Isis, wise and powerful and faithful, skilled in every magic. But Osiris had a brother, Set, a dark and jealous god, lord of the desert and the storm, and Set could not bear his brother's goodness and his brother's glory. And so Set plotted, and by a cruel trick he murdered Osiris, and to make sure he could never return, he cut the body into many pieces and scattered them the length and breadth of Egypt, hiding them where they could never be found. But he had not reckoned with the love of Isis, for when the good king was slain, his queen did not despair. She set out, grieving but unbroken, to search the whole land for the scattered pieces of her husband. She wandered the length of the Nile, through the marshes and the deserts and the fields, gathering the pieces one by one, wherever Set had hidden them. And wherever she wept, the people afterward said, the ground grew fertile. And when she had gathered all the pieces, she used her great magic, and the magic of other gods who aided her, and she bound the body together again, and wrapped it in linen, making, the Egyptians said, the very first mummy. and she breathed life back into him just long enough, and Osiris lived again, though he could no longer remain among the living. Instead, he went down into the land of the dead, and there he became its king, the green-skinned lord of the underworld, the god who, having died and risen, could promise the same rebirth to every faithful soul who came before his throne. And there is more to the story, for Isis bore a son by Osiris, a child named Horus, whom she raised in secret in the marshes of the Delta, hiding him from murderous Set until he grew to manhood. And when he was grown, Horus challenged his wicked uncle, and after long and bitter struggle he defeated him and reclaimed the throne of his father, and became the rightful king of Egypt. And from then on, every living pharaoh was understood to be Horus, the living king, the falcon god upon his throne, while every dead pharaoh became Osiris, the risen lord of the eternal fields. Death and rebirth, loss and love, the green king in the underworld and the falcon king in the sun. It is one of the oldest and most consoling stories that human beings have ever told, and the Egyptians held it close for thousands of years and drew from it their deepest hope, that death is not the end, that love can reach across the boundary of the grave, and that all of us, in the end, may rise again into a life without sorrow. Let that story rest in you now like a warm stone. Isis wandering the river in her grief, gathering the pieces, refusing to let go. It is a story about love outlasting death. And is that not, in a way, the story of Egypt itself, this civilization that gathered itself together again and again, that refused again and again to stay in pieces that would not die? The Middle Kingdom too came at last to its close, as all things in this long story do. It grew weaker over generations, its kings less able, its unity fraying once more. And into that weakness there came, from the northeast, from the lands beyond the Sinai desert, a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, the rulers of foreign lands. They were not a great invading army sweeping across the border in a single terrible day. Rather, they came gradually, over many years, settling in the eastern delta, growing in numbers and strength, until at last they seized power in the north and ruled a good part of Egypt as foreign kings. And this was a bitter thing for the Egyptians, a wound to their deepest pride, for they had always thought of themselves as the one truly civilized people at the centre of the world, and now they found foreigners sitting upon the throne of the north. This was the second intermediate period, the second great gap in the story, the second time the light seemed to flicker. But you already know how the Egyptians answer such moments. Once again, in the south, in Thebes, the old spirit stirred. Once again a line of determined princes gathered their strength and refused to accept that Egypt should be ruled by strangers. And these southern kings had learned something from their foreign overlords, for the Hyksos had brought with them new things, new tools of war, the horse and the war chariot, the powerful bow, weapons of bronze. And the princes of Thebes took up these new weapons and turned them against their teachers. War came to the valley, long and hard, and in the end the Egyptians drove the foreign kings out, back across the desert from which they had come, and reunited the two lands once again, and this time they did more than simply restore what had been lost. This time, hardened by the humiliation of foreign rule, they resolved that Egypt would never again be caught weak and vulnerable. This time, Egypt would not merely defend itself. It would go forth and conquer and build an empire. And so we come now to the greatest and most glorious age of all, the summit of the whole long story, the age of the new kingdom, the age of empire, the age of the pharaohs whose names still echo down to us across the centuries. Settle in now and let yourself grow heavier and softer against the bed, for this is the golden heart of the tale, and I will tell it to you slowly, and you may drift off anywhere along the way, for the river of the story flows on whether you are awake to hear it or not. In this age, Egypt became the mightiest power in all the known world. Its armies marched out of the valley, down into the lands of the east, through the country we now call Israel and Lebanon and Syria, and up the river to the south, deep into Nubia and its gold, tribute flowed into Egypt from a dozen conquered lands, gold and silver, cedar wood and ebony, ivory and incense, exotic animals and beautiful things beyond counting. And with all this wealth, the kings of the New Kingdom built on a scale not seen since the days of the pyramids. But now they built not tombs of stone in the desert, but vast and soaring temples to the gods. Great forests of stone columns, towering gateways, avenues lined with sphinxes, walls covered in painted carvings that still, 3,000 years later, glow with colour when the light falls on them just so. Let yourself imagine Thebes in the height of the New Kingdom, the great southern capital, the richest and most glorious city in all the world in its day. Imagine the river flowing through the heart of it, the boats crowding its banks, the eastern shore where the living dwelt, with its palaces and its markets and its temples, and the western shore where the sun set and the dead were laid to rest, with its tombs and its mortuary temples rising against the tawny cliffs. Imagine the great festivals, when the sacred image of the god Amun was carried out from the dark heart of Karnak in a magnificent procession. Borne upon a golden ceremonial boat upon the shoulders of the priests, out through the great gateways and along the avenues lined with ram-headed sphinxes, while all the people of Thebes came out to line the way, dressed in their finest white linen, garlanded with flowers, singing and dancing and rejoicing, the air thick with incense and music and the perfume of blossoms, the whole city given over to celebration. And imagine the wealth that flowed into this city from the whole empire, the tribute of conquered lands and the trade of distant countries, the gold and the silver, the jewels and the fine cloths, the rare woods and the sweet perfumes, all of it flowing into Thebes, the city of 100 gates, as later ages would call it, the dazzling jewel at the heart of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. And the greatest of all these temple complexes rose at Thebes, the southern city that had given Egypt back its freedom, on the east bank of the river, at a place we now call Karnak. Oh, let me try to give you Karnak as you lie there drifting, for it is one of the most astonishing places human beings have ever made. Imagine walking, in the cool of the early morning, through a great gateway wider than a city street, into a courtyard, and then through another gateway, and into a vast hall, a hall so large that a small cathedral could stand inside it, and this hall is filled, wall to wall, with columns. Not a few columns, a forest of them. More than 130 great stone columns, each one so thick that it would take several people with joined hands to reach around it, each one rising up and up into the dimness far overhead, their tops spreading like the flowers of the papyrus and the lotus, and every surface, every column and wall and ceiling, carved and painted with gods and kings and hieroglyphs. The paint once bright as jewels, and through the small high windows near the roof, shafts of golden sunlight fall down through the dimness, slanting between the great columns, catching the drifting dust, so that to walk there is to walk through a stone forest pierced with beams of light, cool and shadowed and holy, the air heavy with the smell of incense and the murmur of distant chanting. This was the house of the god Amun, the great hidden god, king of all the gods, and here his priests served him. And here the pharaohs came to be crowned and to celebrate their victories, and for 2,000 years king after king added to it, hall by hall, gateway by gateway, until it became the largest religious building in the entire ancient world. And across the river, on the west bank, where the sun set each evening into the land of the dead, the New Kingdom pharaohs made their tombs. But they had learned a hard lesson from the pyramid builders of long ago. For the great pyramids, those enormous stone signposts pointing at the sky, had said to every robber for 1,000 miles, here is where a rich king is buried. Come and dig. And robbed they had been, every one, their treasures stolen, their bodies disturbed. So the kings of the New Kingdom chose secrecy instead of splendour. They chose a lonely, dry, desolate valley hidden in the cliffs on the west bank, a valley overlooked by a single natural peak shaped almost like a pyramid, as if the gods themselves had provided one. And there, in the rock of that hidden valley, they cut their tombs downward and inward, long sloping corridors and stairways descending deep into the mountain, opening into painted chambers where the king would rest, the whole thing sealed and hidden and disguised, its entrance covered over, so that, they hoped, no robber would ever find it. We call this place the Valley of the Kings, and for 500 years the greatest pharaohs of Egypt were laid to rest there, one after another, in the silent heart of the western mountain. And what tombs they made there, deep in the rock. Let me take you, softly, down into one of them, in your imagination, as it was when it was newly finished, before it was sealed forever. Imagine descending a long stairway cut into the living stone, going down into the cool dimness away from the fierce heat of the desert above, the light of oil lamps flickering warm and golden on the walls. And the walls, oh the walls, they are covered from floor to ceiling with paintings, fresh and bright and glowing. The colours deep and rich, blues and greens and golds and reds, every surface alive with images. Here are the gods, in long solemn processions, welcoming the king. Here is the story of the sun's nightly journey through the underworld, hour by hour, painted across the ceiling and the walls, so that the dead king might travel with the sun through the darkness and be reborn with it at dawn. Here are the sacred texts, the spells and the prayers, the words of power that would guide and protect the king on his journey, written out in careful columns of hieroglyphs, tiny perfect pictures marching down the walls. And the air is cool and still and quiet, deep in the mountain, and heavy with the smell of the resins and the oils and the incense. And the lamplight moves gently over the painted gods, and it is beautiful, and it is peaceful, this house prepared for a king to sleep in forever. And in the deepest chamber lay the king himself, in his nested coffins, within his great stone sarcophagus, his body carefully preserved and wrapped and masked, surrounded by everything he might need for eternity, the furniture and the food and the treasures and the little servant figures that would work for him in the fields of the afterlife, so that he need never labour. And when all was ready, the priests spoke the last prayers, and the mourners made their last farewells, and the tomb was closed and sealed, and the entrance was hidden and covered over, and the king was left alone at last in the silent dark, to begin his long journey into eternity, to sail with the sun through the underworld and rise reborn into the everlasting fields. And there, in that stillness and that dark, most of those kings slept on, undisturbed for a while, and disturbed at last by robbers in most cases. But in one blessed case, the case of the boy king Tutankhamun, undisturbed for more than 3,000 years, sleeping the long sleep of the pharaohs in the heart of the western mountain, while the whole world turned above. But before we come to the pharaohs of this golden age, let us linger a while among the gods, for the gods were everywhere in Egypt, woven through every hour of every day, and their world is a rich and dreamlike one to wander through as sleep draws near. The Egyptians did not have a single god, nor even a small handful. They had hundreds, a great teeming crowd of gods and goddesses, some worshipped across the whole land, some belonging only to a single town or a single family, some very great and some very small. And to the Egyptian mind, there was nothing strange or contradictory in this. The divine was simply everywhere, in the sun and the river and the earth and the sky, in the animals and the plants, in the home and the field and the tomb. And each of these many gods was a face, a way of seeing, a doorway on to the great mystery that lay behind all things. Chief among them, in this new kingdom age, was Amun, the hidden one, whose very name meant the hidden or the unseen, the great mysterious power behind all creation, and he was joined with the ancient sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, king of all the gods, whose enormous temple was Karnak, that stone forest of which I have already told you. And there was Ra himself, or Re, the sun, the oldest and in some ways the greatest of all, who sailed each day across the sky in his boat of the sun, from the eastern horizon at dawn to the western horizon at dusk, and who then, each night, sailed on through the dark and dangerous waters of the underworld, doing battle with the great serpent of chaos, and emerging victorious again each dawn reborn, so that every single sunrise was, to the Egyptian mind, a fresh triumph of light over darkness, of order over chaos, of life over death, repeated faithfully every single morning since the beginning of the world. And there was Osiris, whose beautiful story of death and resurrection I have already told you, the green-skinned lord of the dead and of rebirth, and his faithful wife Isis, the great goddess of magic and motherhood and healing, whose love reached across the boundary of the grave, and who became in the end perhaps the most beloved goddess of all, worshipped even far beyond the borders of Egypt, in Greece and in Rome, and across the whole ancient world, the divine mother who cradled her child, who wept for her lost husband, who never abandoned those who called upon her. And there was their son Horus, the falcon-headed god, the sky, whose two eyes were the sun and the moon, and who was the living king upon his throne. And there was Dark Set, the god of the desert and the storm and disorder, the murderer of Osiris, though even he was not wholly evil, for the Egyptians understood that the world needed its wildness as well as its order, that the desert had its place beside the sown field. And there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god, the guardian of the dead and the guide of souls, the one who watched over the sacred work of mummification, and who stood beside the great scale in the Hall of Two Truths to oversee the weighing of the heart. Picture him, the tall dark figure with the head of a jackal, kneeling attentively beside the golden balance, adjusting it with a careful hand. The Egyptians gave him the jackal's head, because the jackals prowled the desert edges near the cemeteries, and so they made the guardian of the graveyard into a jackal, and made him not a terror, but a protector, the gentle guide who would lead the dead safely through the shadowed land. And there was Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing and knowledge, with the head of an ibis, that long-beaked wading bird, or sometimes in the form of a baboon, and it was Thoth who had given human beings the great gift of writing, and who recorded the verdict at the weighing of the heart, the divine scribe who wrote down the fates of souls. And there was gentle Hathor, the goddess of love and joy and music and beauty and motherhood, often shown as a cow, or as a woman with a cow's horns cradling the disk of the sun, a warm and tender and joyful goddess who welcomed the dead into the west with kindness. And there was Bastet the cat goddess, of whom I have spoken, and Sobek the crocodile god of the river and its dangers, and Chnum the ram-headed god who shaped human beings on his potter's wheel, and Sekhmet the fierce lioness goddess of war and healing, and Ptah the great craftsman god of Memphis, and Maat herself, the goddess of truth and balance and cosmic order, with her single feather, and so many, many more, a whole living universe of the divine. And to serve all these gods, the Egyptians built their temples. And the temple in Egypt was not like a church or a place of public worship as we might imagine it. It was rather the house of the god, the literal dwelling place where the god was believed to live, in the form of a sacred statue kept in the innermost sanctuary, deep within the temple, in the darkest and holiest chamber of all. And the ordinary people did not enter there. Only the priests could pass into the inner sanctuary, and each day they performed the sacred rituals of caring for the god as one would care for a living being, waking the statue in the morning, washing it, clothing it in fresh linen, anointing it with oils, setting before it offerings of food and drink, burning fragrant incense, singing the ancient hymns, and then at evening putting the god to rest again, closing and sealing the doors of the sanctuary for the night. Day after day, year after year, century after century, in temples the length of the land, this quiet, sacred service went on, the tending of the gods, the keeping of the great bargain that held the world in balance, and the walls of these temples and of the tombs were covered everywhere with writing, that beautiful and mysterious writing we call hieroglyphs. Let me tell you a little of the hieroglyphs, for they are one of the loveliest things the Egyptians made. The word means sacred carvings, and that is what they were, a writing made of pictures, little images carved and painted in rows and columns, birds and eyes and feet and reeds and water ripples and coiled ropes and seated figures and countless other small perfect pictures, each one a tiny work of art in itself. And this picture writing could stand for sounds, like the letters of an alphabet, or for whole words and ideas, in a rich and subtle system that took long years to master, so that the scribes who could read and write were among the most respected and privileged people in all of Egypt, for writing was power, writing was memory. Writing was the very thing that let a civilization remember itself across the centuries. And a young Egyptian who learned to be a scribe escaped the hard labour of the fields and the workshops, and rose in the world, and the fathers of Egypt urged their sons to study hard and become scribes. For the scribe, they said, was the master of his own fate. Imagine a scribe at his work, sitting cross-legged on the ground, his kilt stretched taut across his knees to make a writing surface, his palette of black and red ink resting beside him, his reed brush in his hand, his roll of smooth papyrus spread before him, writing out the accounts of the harvest, or the words of a story, or the letters of an official, or the sacred prayers for the dead. And imagine the great store of writing that such scribes produced across the thousands of years, the tax records and the temple accounts, yes, but also the poetry, the love songs, the wisdom sayings, the hymns to the gods, the letters from one person to another, the tales of adventure and magic, the medical texts, the mathematical texts, a whole vast literature, much of which has been lost, but some of which survives, so that we can still read, today, the very words that Egyptians wrote 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, their prayers and their poems and their private letters, and hear, faint but clear across all that immense distance of time, the true living voices of the people themselves. Let all of that rest gently in your mind now, the whole crowded, warm world of the Egyptian gods and their temples and their beautiful picture writing. The sun sailing across the sky in his boat and battling the serpent in the dark, Isis cradling her child, Anubis kneeling by the golden scale, Thoth writing down the fates of souls, the priests in their white linen tending the sacred statue in the dark inner room, morning and evening, year after year, the scribe at his papyrus, setting down the words that would outlast him by thousands of years. It is a rich world to drift through as sleep approaches, warm and golden and strange, and very, very old. Now let me tell you of some of those pharaohs, for their names are worth knowing, and their stories will carry you gently on towards sleep. There was a queen, first of all, a most remarkable woman, whose name was Hatshepsut, and her story is unusual, for Egypt was almost always ruled by kings, by men, and yet here was a woman who took the throne and ruled as pharaoh in her own right, and ruled brilliantly. She came to power at first as a regent, governing on behalf of a young stepson who was too young to rule. But in time she took the full title and power of pharaoh for herself, and so that the world would understand her authority in the only language it knew, she had herself depicted in the traditional regalia of a king, even with the ceremonial false beard that pharaohs wore as a symbol of their office. Do not picture something strange or sad in this. Picture instead a woman of enormous ability and iron will, doing what she must to hold and wield a power that had almost never been given to a woman before. And her reign was not a reign of war, but of peace and of splendour and of trade. She sent a great expedition far to the south, to a distant and half-legendary land called Punt, somewhere down along the coast of the Red Sea, and her ships returned laden with wonders, with gold and ebony and ivory and exotic animals, and above all with fragrant myrrh trees, whole living trees in baskets, to be planted in the gardens of the gods. And she built on the west bank at Thebes one of the most beautiful buildings in all of Egypt, a great temple of pale stone rising in 3 broad terraces against the tawny cliffs, its long rows of columns catching the morning light, so perfectly proportioned that it seems almost to grow out of the mountain behind it. Hatshepsut, the woman who was king. Let her rest in your memory as a queen of peace and of beauty. and after her there came a warrior, her stepson grown to manhood, a pharaoh named Thutmose, the third of that name, and he was perhaps the greatest general Egypt ever produced, a small and tireless man who led his armies again and again out of the valley and into the lands of the east, winning battle after battle, extending the empire to its very greatest reach. He fought a famous battle at a place called Megiddo, in the land we now call Israel, where he outwitted a great alliance of enemy kings by leading his army through a narrow and dangerous mountain pass that they had left unguarded, appearing suddenly before them where they least expected him, and winning a great victory. Some have called him the Napoleon of Egypt, and under him the empire stretched farther than it ever had before or ever would again, and the tribute of many lands flowed into the temples of Thebes. And now let me tell you of a strange and dreamlike chapter, one of the most curious in all the long story, the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten. For a very long time the Egyptians had worshipped a great crowd of gods, hundreds of them, gods of the sun and the river and the harvest, gods with the heads of falcons and jackals and cats and crocodiles, a rich and teeming world of the divine, presided over by the priests of Amun at Thebes, who had grown over the centuries enormously wealthy and powerful. And then there came to the throne a most unusual king, a dreamer, a mystic, a revolutionary. His name at first was Amenhotep, but he changed it, for he had conceived a strange and radical new idea. He decided that there was, in truth, only one God worth worshipping, and that God was the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself, the source of all life and warmth and growth. And he changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning he who is beneficial to the Aten, and he did a thing that had never been done in Egypt before. He tried to sweep away all the old gods, all of them, and to worship the sun disk alone. He closed the old temples, he turned away from Amun and from Thebes, and he built himself an entirely new capital city, out in the desert, on virgin ground where no god had ever been worshipped before, a shining new city dedicated wholly to the Aten, with open-air temples, where the light of the sun could fall directly upon the offerings, unlike the dark and shadowed shrines of the old gods. And in this new city he lived with his beautiful queen, whose name was Nefertiti, whose face you may know even now, for a painted bust of her survived the ages, and she is still, 3,000 years later, considered one of the most beautiful faces ever made by human hands, with her long, graceful neck and her serene half-smile and her tall blue crown. And the art of this strange, dreaming reign changed too, becoming softer and stranger and more intimate, showing the royal family not in stiff and formal poses but tenderly, the king and queen playing with their small daughters, the sun disk above them reaching down its long rays, each ray ending in a small human hand, offering the gift of life. It is oddly moving, this art, oddly warm and human, from so distant an age. But the revolution of Akhenaten did not last. It was too strange, too sudden, too great a break with everything the Egyptians knew and loved. The people missed their old gods, the whole rich crowded family of them. The powerful priests of Amun bided their time. And when Akhenaten died, his dream died with him. His new city in the desert was abandoned, left to the sand. The old gods were restored, and a young boy came to the throne, a boy whose name at first honoured the sun disk, but which was soon changed to honour the old god Amun once again. And that boy's name, that new name, was Tutankhamun. Ah, now you know this name. Almost everyone knows this name. The boy king, King Tut. And here is one of the great strange ironies of all history, tender and a little sad. In his own lifetime, Tutankhamun was a minor king, a boy who came to the throne at perhaps 8 or 9 years old and died at only around 18 or 19, having reigned only a handful of years, mostly under the guidance of older advisors who did the real work of undoing Akhenaten's revolution and setting Egypt back on its ancient path. He was not a great conqueror, he was not a great builder. He was a frail young man, we now think, who suffered from illness and pain, and who died very young, and who was buried, rather hastily, in a small tomb, and then very nearly forgotten, his name almost erased from the official records by later kings who wished to blot out the whole strange episode of Akhenaten and everything connected to it. And yet, of all the pharaohs of Egypt, of all the great conquerors and mighty builders, of all the queens and kings whose names filled the temples, it is this obscure, half-forgotten boy whose name is now the most famous in all the world. And why? Because his tomb was forgotten. Because it was small and hidden and covered over by the debris of later building work, so that the robbers who plundered nearly every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings simply never found it. It lay there, sealed and silent, in the dark heart of the mountain, for more than 3,000 years, while empires rose and fell above it, while the Romans came and went, while the Arabs came, while the whole modern world was born. And all that time the boy king lay undisturbed in his golden coffin, surrounded by his treasures, waiting. And then, in the year 1922, a patient English archaeologist named Howard Carter, who had searched that valley for years and was very nearly out of money and out of hope, found a single stone step cut into the valley floor, hidden beneath the rubble of an ancient workman's hut. And he dug, and found another step, and another, a whole staircase descending into the rock, and at the bottom of it a sealed doorway, its ancient seals still intact, unbroken for 3,000 years. And when at last he made a small hole in that doorway, and held up a candle and put his eye to the gap, and peered through into the darkness that no living person had seen for 30 centuries, one of the people with him asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter, we are told, was struck silent for a long moment, and then he answered, "Yes, wonderful things." For the little tomb was crammed, packed almost to the ceiling, with the most astonishing treasure, thousands of objects, gilded couches and chariots and thrones, statues and shrines and chests, jewellery and weapons and furniture, everything a young king might need in the eternal life to come, all of it gleaming with gold, all of it just as it had been left 3,000 years before. And at the very heart of it, within nested golden shrines, within a great stone sarcophagus, within 3 nested coffins, the innermost of which was made of solid gold, lay the mummy of the young king himself, his face covered by a mask of golden blue, of such serene and haunting beauty that it has become, for the whole world, the very face of ancient Egypt itself. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, you have surely seen it. And so it happened that the least of the great pharaohs became, through the pure accident of being forgotten, the most remembered of them all, his name known in every corner of the earth, the boy king who conquered nothing in life, and yet who, in death, conquered the imagination of the entire world. There is something in that which is worth carrying gently into your dreams, that the smallest and most overlooked may, in the fullness of time, shine the brightest of all. Rest now for a moment. Let the golden light of that tomb glow softly behind your closed eyes. We have come very far tonight, down the long river of the centuries, from the first villages in the mud to the golden mask of the boy king. And still the story is not done, for the greatest builder of all the pharaohs is yet to come. His name was Ramesses, the second of that name, and he is often called Ramesses the Great, and he ruled for an extraordinarily long time, some 66 years. So long that many of his subjects lived their entire lives and died having known no other pharaoh, so long that he outlived a dozen of his own sons, so long that he became almost a living god in the minds of his people, the eternal king who had simply always been and always would be. And he was a builder such as Egypt had never seen. He raised temples and statues and monuments the length and breadth of the land, more than any pharaoh before or after him, until his name was carved on stone in every corner of Egypt, until it seemed that wherever one looked, there was Ramesses, Ramesses, Ramesses. His great cartouche, the oval ring that enclosed a royal name, cut so deep into the hard stone that no later king could ever chisel it away. And far to the south, on the edge of Nubia, at a place called Abu Simbel, he carved a temple directly out of the living cliff, and before it he set 4 colossal statues of himself, seated, each one over 60 feet tall, each one gazing out serenely across the river toward the rising sun, so vast that a grown person would stand no taller than the ankle of one of these stone giants. And within the temple he arranged the design so cleverly, so precisely, that twice each year, on 2 special mornings, the rising sun would shine straight down the long dark corridor cut deep into the mountain and illuminate the statues of the gods seated in the innermost sanctuary far inside the rock. Twice a year for 3,000 years, that shaft of dawn light has reached in through the darkness to touch the faces of the gods, a marvel of engineering and of vision that still astonishes us today. And Ramesses was a warrior too, or at least he was determined that the world should remember him as one. Early in his reign he fought a great battle against the empire of the Hittites, a mighty rival power from the north, at a place called Kadesh in Syria. And the battle itself was, in truth, something close to a draw, a near disaster in which Ramesses and his personal guard were nearly cut off and overwhelmed, and only narrowly fought their way clear. But you would never know that from the way Ramesses told it. He had the story of Kadesh carved on temple walls all across Egypt, and in his telling it, it became a glorious personal triumph, the pharaoh alone and mighty, charging into the massed ranks of the enemy, scattering thousands, a living god upon the battlefield. It is one of the earliest examples in all of history of a ruler shaping the story of his own deeds, casting himself as the hero, and it worked. For we remember him still as Ramesses the Great. And there is a further wonder in the story of Kadesh. For years after the battle, Ramesses and the king of the Hittites made peace, and they wrote down the terms, and that treaty survives, one of the very first peace treaties in all of recorded history, an agreement between 2 great empires, sworn before the gods to end their war and live as brothers. Even in the age of the great warrior Pharaoh, there was room, in the end, for peace. Many believe that Ramesses the Great may be the pharaoh of the famous old story of Moses and the Exodus, the pharaoh who would not let the enslaved people go, though the truth of that we cannot know for certain, for the Egyptians left no record of it, and the story comes to us from another people and another tradition. But whether or not he was that pharaoh, Ramesses reigned so long and so gloriously that his death, when it finally came, must have felt to his people almost like the end of the world, for so few of them could remember a time before him. And in a way, it was a kind of ending, for although Egypt would go on for many more centuries, and although there would be more kings named Ramesses after him, the great age of empire had reached its summit under him, and after him, slowly, gently, the long descent began. Feel how the story is turning now, as the night deepens around you. We have climbed the long slope, from the first villages to the pyramids to the Golden Empire and its greatest king, and now the river begins, imperceptibly at first, to carry us down the far side. But do not feel any sadness in this, for the descent of Egypt was itself long and rich, and even in its slow decline, this stubborn civilization refused again and again to simply die. After the great Ramesses, the pharaohs who followed were, for the most part, lesser men. The empire abroad slowly slipped away, province by province, as Egypt lost the strength to hold its distant conquests. At home, the priests of Amun at Thebes had grown so wealthy and so powerful, owning so much of the land and commanding so many people, that they came to rival the king himself. Until in time Egypt was effectively split once more, the pharaohs ruling in the north and the high priests of Amun ruling as near kings in the south. The old tomb robbers, grown bold, plundered even the sacred Valley of the Kings, breaking into the tombs of the mightiest pharaohs, stripping the gold from their coffins, so that at last the priests, in sorrow and desperation, gathered up the violated royal mummies, the great kings of old, Thutmose and Ramesses and so many others, and hid them away together in secret caches in the cliffs to save them from destruction, where they would lie hidden and safe for another 3,000 years until our own age discovered them. And so Egypt entered another long, dim, divided age. The third intermediate period, weaker and more fragmented than before. And in these centuries of weakness, the ancient land began to fall, again and again, under the power of foreigners. There came a time when kings from Nubia, from the south, from the land Egypt had once conquered, marched north and took the throne, ruling Egypt as pharaohs themselves, and, curiously, these Nubian kings so revered the ancient traditions of Egypt that they became among the most devoted guardians of its old ways, reviving the old arts, building pyramids of their own in their southern homeland. And there came the mighty empire of Assyria, from far to the east, whose iron armies swept into Egypt and sacked even the ancient city of Thebes. And there came, after the Assyrians, the vast empire of Persia, whose kings added Egypt to their enormous dominion and ruled it as a distant province, so that for long stretches the pharaoh of Egypt was a foreign emperor who had perhaps never even seen the Nile. And yet, through all of this, through conquest after conquest and foreign master after foreign master, the deep old culture of Egypt endured. The gods were still worshipped, the temples still stood and were still tended, and new ones were still built. The priests still shaved their heads and wore their white linen and spoke the ancient prayers. The farmers still watched for the flood and planted in the black silt and harvested the golden grain. Exactly as their ancestors had done 4,000 years before. The hieroglyphs were still carved. The dead were still mummified. Foreign kings came and went, empires rose and fell, but the slow deep rhythm of Egyptian life went on, patient and unbroken, like the river itself, which did not care who claimed to rule its banks, and simply kept flooding, every year, faithful and eternal. This is the deepest meaning of our theme tonight, the civilization that refused to die. It was conquered, again and again, and yet it was never truly extinguished, for its roots ran too deep, deeper than any conqueror could reach, all the way down to the river and the black land and the 4,000-year-old certainty of the flood. And then, into this ancient and weary and much conquered land, there came a young man from far away, from the cold rough hills of Greece, a young conqueror the like of whom the world had never seen. His name was Alexander, and history calls him Alexander the Great, and he was the king of Macedon, and he had set out from his small northern kingdom to conquer the whole of the known world. And he was, astonishingly, very nearly succeeding. He shattered the great Persian Empire that had ruled Egypt, and his armies swept down into the ancient land, and the Egyptians, weary of their harsh Persian masters, welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. And Alexander, for his part, treated the old gods of Egypt with respect. He journeyed across the desert to a remote and sacred oracle, where it was said the priests hailed him as the son of a god, as the rightful pharaoh. And on the shore of the Mediterranean, where the westernmost branch of the Nile Delta met the sea, he founded a new city, and he gave it his own name, Alexandria. And though he himself soon marched away to further conquests and died young, far to the east, never to return, that city he founded would become, in time, one of the greatest and most brilliant cities in the entire ancient world. For after Alexander died, his vast empire was carved up among his generals, and Egypt fell to one of them, a shrewd and capable Macedonian Greek named Ptolemy. And Ptolemy made himself king of Egypt, and founded a dynasty, a line of kings who would rule the ancient land for nearly 300 years, all of them named, generation after generation, Ptolemy. They were Greeks, these new pharaohs, foreign in blood and in language, and they kept themselves apart in many ways, ruling from the glittering Greek city of Alexandria rather than from ancient Thebes or Memphis. And Alexandria became a wonder of the world. There they built a great lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the tallest structures on earth, its fire visible far out to sea, guiding ships safely into the harbour, and it too was counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. and there they built the great Library of Alexandria, the most famous library in all of history, which sought to gather within its walls a copy of every book ever written, all the knowledge of the whole world, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, and the great scholars and scientists and philosophers of the age came there to study and to teach, so that Alexandria became the shining centre of learning for the entire Mediterranean world. Let me linger a while in this Alexandria, for it is a wonderful place to rest the mind, this last great city of the ancient world to rise upon Egyptian soil. Imagine it there upon the Mediterranean shore, white and gleaming, laid out in broad straight avenues, the first great planned city of its age, cooled by the sea breeze, thronged with people from every corner of the known world, Greeks and Egyptians and Jews and Syrians and Romans and traders from lands still further off. A great mingling of tongues and people such as the world had rarely seen. Imagine its magnificent harbour, one of the busiest in the world, crowded with ships from every port, their sails white against the blue, bringing goods and travellers and books and ideas from everywhere, and taking away, above all, the golden grain of Egypt. For Egypt was the granary that fed much of the ancient world, and the ships came for its wheat and sailed away heavy with it. And guarding that harbour, rising from a small island just offshore, stood the great lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the tallest structures on the whole earth, a towering column of pale stone climbing hundreds of feet into the sky, and at its summit a great fire burned by night, its light thrown far out across the dark water by polished mirrors, so that sailors far out at sea could see it and steer safely home. It was so famous, so wondrous, that its very name, Pharos, became the word for lighthouse in many languages, and it was counted, like the Great Pyramid, among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it stood for many centuries, faithfully burning its fire through the night, guiding the ships in from the dark sea. And at the heart of the city stood the great library, the most famous library in all of history, the wonder of the age, gathered by the Ptolemaic kings who dreamed of collecting within its walls a copy of every book ever written in the whole world, all of human knowledge under one roof. And they came very near to it. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls filled its shelves, and the kings sent agents far and wide to buy or copy every book they could find, and it was said that every ship that put into the harbour of Alexandria had to surrender any books it carried to be copied for the library. And joined to the library was a great institution of learning, a place where the finest scholars and scientists and poets and philosophers of the age were gathered together, given their keep, and set free simply to study and to think and to teach and to discover, and out of that gathering came some of the greatest achievements of ancient science. There a scholar measured the size of the whole round earth, and came astonishingly close to the true figure, simply by measuring shadows and reasoning with great care. There the foundations of geometry were set down in a book that would be studied for more than 2,000 years. There the movements of the stars and the planets were mapped and studied. There the human body was examined and understood as never before. Alexandria became the great lamp of learning for the whole Mediterranean world, and for the mind of humankind it shone almost as brightly as its own great lighthouse shone for the ships at sea. It is a bitter-sweet thing to rest upon, this shining city and its great library, for much of what it gathered was lost in the end, scattered and destroyed across the troubled centuries that followed, so that we can only imagine now what treasures of ancient thought and poetry and knowledge once filled those shelves and are now gone forever. But let us not dwell on the loss tonight. Let us dwell instead on the glory, on that brilliant city by the sea, white and gleaming, its harbour full of ships, its lighthouse burning against the night, its library full of all the wisdom of the world, its streets full of every people under the sun, the last great flowering of the ancient world upon the soil of Egypt, the meeting place of Greece and Egypt and the whole Mediterranean, a beautiful and luminous thing to hold in the mind as the night deepens and sleep draws near. And yet, foreign as they were, these Ptolemaic kings understood the ancient bargain of Egypt. They understood that to rule this land one had to be its pharaoh in the old way. And so they took up the old titles and the old regalia. They had themselves depicted on the temple walls in the traditional garb of the pharaohs, making offerings to the old gods in the old style, indistinguishable, on the stone, from the pharaohs of 2,000 years before. They built great temples to the Egyptian gods, temples so well made and so well preserved that they are today among the most complete and beautiful in all of Egypt. Their walls still covered from floor to ceiling with the old gods and the old prayers. The old civilization, even now in its very last chapter, even under Greek kings, refused to die and drew its foreign masters into its own ancient ways. And so we come at last to the final scene of the whole long story, to the last pharaoh of Egypt, to the most famous woman of the entire ancient world, a name known even to those who know nothing else of Egypt. Cleopatra, the seventh queen of that name in the Ptolemaic line, and by far the most remarkable. Let us be clear about who she truly was, for the legends have somewhat clouded her. She was not by blood an Egyptian at all, but a Greek, a descendant of that first general Ptolemy, the last and greatest of his line. But unlike all the Greek kings before her, unlike her own father and her ancestors, who had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years without ever bothering to learn the language of the people they ruled, Cleopatra did learn it. She was, by all accounts, a woman of dazzling intelligence, fluent in many languages, deeply learned, a shrewd and capable ruler, and she alone, of all her dynasty, is said to have spoken the Egyptian tongue, and she presented herself to her people not as a foreign Greek queen, but as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the last true pharaoh of a 4,000-year-old line. In her, the two worlds met, the brilliant Greek civilization of Alexandria and the immeasurably ancient civilization of the Nile, and she wore both crowns, so to speak, and wore them well. But she came to the throne at a most dangerous moment, for by her day a new and terrible power had risen in the West, a power greater than any the world had yet seen, the power of Rome. Rome was swallowing the whole Mediterranean world, kingdom by kingdom, and it cast its hungry eye upon wealthy Egypt, the richest prize of all, the great granary that could feed the whole Roman world. And Cleopatra understood, with perfect clarity, that her ancient kingdom could not hope to defeat Rome by force. If Egypt was to survive at all, if she was to keep her throne and her land free, it would have to be through cunning, through alliance, through the binding of Egypt's fate to the most powerful men in Rome, and that is precisely what she set out to do. The first of those men was Julius Caesar himself, the greatest of all the Romans, who came to Egypt in the midst of Rome's civil wars. Cleopatra, driven from her throne by rivals, needed his help, and there is a famous old story, which may or may not be true, that she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled up inside a carpet or a bundle of bedding, and when it was unrolled before him, there she was, the young queen, and Caesar was captivated. Whatever the truth of the carpet, it is certain that the two became allies and more than allies, that Caesar restored her to her throne, and that she bore him a son. And when Caesar returned to Rome, he brought Cleopatra there for a time, this exotic queen from the ancient land, and the Romans stared at her with fascination and suspicion in equal measure. But Caesar was murdered, cut down by conspirators in Rome, and after his death Rome fell again into civil war, and out of that struggle two great men rose to divide the Roman world between them. And Cleopatra, ever the shrewd survivor, bound her fortunes and Egypt's to one of them, a bold and charismatic Roman general named Mark Antony. And their story became one of the great love stories of all history, though it was also always a story of politics and power, of a queen fighting to save her ancient kingdom by every means she had. Antony came to Alexandria and was dazzled by its wealth and its splendour and its queen, and the two of them lived, for a time, in a blaze of glory, feasting and revelling and dreaming, it was said, of ruling the whole Eastern world together, of founding a new dynasty that would join Egypt and Rome. But the other great man of Rome, the cold and patient and calculating heir of Caesar, a young man named Octavian, would not permit it. He turned the Roman people against Antony and Cleopatra, painting them as decadent traitors, a Roman general bewitched and unmanned by a scheming foreign queen. And in the end it came to war, to a great sea battle fought off the coast of Greece at a place called Actium. And there the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by the fleet of Octavian, and the dream collapsed. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, back to Alexandria, with Octavian and the might of Rome closing in behind them. And here the long, long story of ancient Egypt comes to its quiet and tragic close. When Octavian's armies reached Alexandria, all was lost. Antony, believing a false report that Cleopatra was already dead, took his own life and died, the old stories say, in her arms. And Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the last living link to that 4,000-year-old line of kings, faced the certain knowledge that Octavian meant to take her back to Rome as a captive, to parade her in chains through the streets as a trophy of his triumph. And this she would not endure. She was a queen, the descendant of Alexander's general and, in her own mind and her people's, the living Isis, the pharaoh of an immeasurably ancient land, and she would not be led through Rome in chains for the crowds to jeer at. And so, in her palace in Alexandria, surrounded by her faithful servants dressed in her full royal regalia, her crown upon her head, she chose her own death instead. The most famous story says that she had a venomous serpent, an asp, brought to her hidden in a basket of figs, and that she let it bite her, and died by the poison of the very cobra that had been, since the earliest days of the kingdom, the sacred symbol of the crown of Lower Egypt, the rearing serpent upon the pharaoh's brow. Whether that is exactly how it happened we cannot know, but the image is a fitting one. The last pharaoh dying by the bite of the royal serpent, the ancient symbol of Egyptian kingship, claiming its last queen. And with her death, the story ended. Octavian, who would soon rename himself Augustus and become the first emperor of Rome, took Egypt not as an ally, but as a possession, a province of the Roman Empire, the personal property of the emperor himself, and the 4,000-year line of the pharaohs, unbroken from that first king who joined the two crowns upon a single brow, came at last to its end. There would never be another pharaoh. The double crown was set aside forever. Egypt, the oldest of kingdoms, became simply a part of someone else's empire, a distant land that grew the grain to feed the city of Rome. And yet, even now, even here at the very end, the civilization would not truly die. For though the pharaohs were gone, the deep culture of Egypt lived on for centuries more under Roman rule, the old gods still worshipped, the old temples still standing, the old rhythms of the river still turning. The Roman emperors, like the Greek kings before them, had themselves carved on the temple walls in the garb of pharaohs, making offerings to Isis and Osiris and Amun, so that the ancient forms continued even as the reality behind them faded. It took centuries for the old religion finally to grow quiet, for the last priest who could read the sacred hieroglyphs to close his eyes for the last time, for the temples at last to fall silent, and the meaning of the old writing to be forgotten, so utterly forgotten that for well over 1,000 years no living person on earth could read a single word of it, and the hieroglyphs became mere beautiful, mysterious pictures, their voices lost. But even that was not the end. For the story of Egypt has an epilogue, a final proof that this civilization refused, absolutely refused, ever truly to die. Because in our own age, the lost voice of ancient Egypt was found again. For centuries the hieroglyphs stared out from the temple walls, silent, unreadable, guarding their secrets. And then, a little more than 200 years ago, a stone was discovered, quite by accident, by soldiers digging in the delta, a broken slab of dark stone covered in writing. And on that stone, the same message was carved 3 times, in 3 different scripts, and one of them was the mysterious hieroglyphs, and another was ancient Greek, which scholars could still read. The Rosetta Stone we call it, and it was the key. For if the Greek could be read, and the Greek said the same thing as the hieroglyphs, then perhaps with enough patience and genius, the hieroglyphs could be read too. And after years of painstaking work, a brilliant young Frenchman named Champollion did exactly that. He cracked the code, he gave the silent stones their voices back, and suddenly, after more than 1,000 years of silence, ancient Egypt could speak again. And all those endless carved walls, all those temple inscriptions and tomb paintings and papyrus scrolls, which had been mute and mysterious for so long, began to tell their stories once more. The names of the kings, the prayers to the gods, the accounts of harvests and battles and loves and deaths, the whole vast 4,000-year record of the civilization pouring out again into the light after its long, long silence. And so, in the end, the civilization that refused to die has, in a sense, come back to life in our own time. Its treasures fill the great museums of the world. Its golden mask gazes out at millions. Its pyramids still stand upon their plateau, exactly where they were raised 45 centuries ago, still the most recognizable structures on the face of the earth. Its story is taught to children in every land. Its gods and its pharaohs and its mummies live on in 1,000 books and films and dreams. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, is remembered still, and Tutankhamun, the boy king, and Rameses the Great, and mighty Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, and even that first architect Imhotep, who so long ago first thought to pile stone upon stone and reach for the sky. 4,000 years of history, and it is all still here, still with us, still remembered, still refusing, after all this time, to fade away and be forgotten. And now, before we return at last to the river where we began, let us pause here in the quiet and gather up the whole long story, gently, the way Isis gathered the pieces of Osiris, and hold it all together for a moment in the mind, one last soft recounting of the great journey we have made tonight. For it has been a very long journey, down a very long river of time, and if you have drifted in and out along the way, as sleep listeners always do, that is perfectly all right, for I will draw it all together for you now, softly, so that even half asleep you may hold the whole shape of it, like a warm and gentle dream. We began at the very beginning, 10,000 years ago and more, when the world was greener and the desert had not yet come, and small bands of people were drawn, as the land dried around them, toward the one thing that never failed, the great river Nile, flowing north through its long green valley. And they settled beside it, in villages of mud brick, and they learned the rhythm of the flood, the yearly miracle of the rising waters and the gift of black silt. And they watched the star Sirius for the coming of the flood, and they made their calendar and their pottery and their fine white linen, and they buried their dead with hope. And slowly, over thousands of quiet years, their villages grew into towns, and their towns into two great kingdoms, the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, the vulture and the cobra, the narrow valley and the spreading delta. And then, more than 5,000 years ago, a king of the south, whom they remembered as Narmer, joined the two lands into one, and set the double crown upon his brow, and founded the great white-walled city of Memphis at the seam of the two lands. And so the long line of the pharaohs began, that unbroken thread of god-kings whose sacred duty was to uphold Ma'at, the balance of the world, to hold back chaos, to keep the sun rising and the river flooding. And in the great age we call the Old Kingdom, Egypt reached up toward the heavens and built the pyramids, beginning with the step pyramid that wise Imhotep raised for King Djoser, and rising to the perfect true pyramids of Sneferu, and to the greatest of them all, the great pyramid of Khufu at Giza, that mountain of 2 million stones once cased in gleaming white, still standing after 45 centuries, built not by slaves, but by the whole people of Egypt, working together to send their king up to the stars, and to conquer death itself through the careful art of mummification and the weighing of the light heart against the feather of truth. And then the Old Kingdom fell, as the floods failed and the central power crumbled, and Egypt broke apart in the first dark gap of its story. But it would not stay broken, for it never stayed broken, and out of the confusion, the princes of Thebes in the south rose up and joined the two lands again, and Egypt was reborn into the Middle Kingdom, a wiser and more reflective age. The age when the beautiful story of Osiris and Isis rose to the height of its power, the story of death and love and resurrection that lay at the heart of all Egyptian hope. And then the Middle Kingdom too grew weak, and the foreign Hyksos came into the delta and ruled the north, the second dark gap in the story, and once again the princes of Thebes rose up and drove the foreigners out, and this time they did not stop at their own borders but marched forth to build an empire, and so began the greatest age of all, the New Kingdom. And in that golden age of empire, Egypt became the mightiest power in the world and built its soaring temples, the great stone forest of Karnak, house of hidden Amun, and hid its kings in the secret valley of the kings on the western bank where the sun goes down. And we walked among its gods, the whole warm, crowded family of them, sun-sailing Ra and green Osiris and faithful Isis and falcon Horus and jackal Anubis and wise Thoth and gentle Hathor and all the rest, tended day and night by the priests in their white linen in the dark inner rooms of the temples, their names and their prayers written everywhere in the beautiful sacred picture writing of the hieroglyphs. And we met the great pharaohs of that age, Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as king and sent her ships to distant Punt and built her lovely terraced temple against the cliffs, and Thutmose, the great conqueror who led his armies to the edge of the world, and dreaming Akhenaten, who tried to sweep away the old gods and worship the sun disk alone, with his beautiful queen Nefertiti, and after him the boy king Tutankhamun, least of the great pharaohs in life, but greatest of all in memory, whose forgotten tomb lay hidden and untouched for 3,000 years until Howard Carter's candle lit up its wonderful things and its golden mask, and mighty Ramesses the Great, the builder above all builders, who reigned for 66 years and raised his colossal statues at Abu Simbel, and carved his name into the stone of Egypt so deep it could never be erased. And then, after Ramesses, the long gentle descent began. The empire slipped away, the land divided again. Foreign masters came, the Nubians and the Assyrians and the Persians, one after another, and yet through it all the deep old culture of Egypt endured, the gods still worshipped, the temples still standing, the river still flooding, the farmers still planting in the black silt exactly as their ancestors had done. And then came Alexander the Great, and founded shining Alexandria, and after him the Greek kings named Ptolemy, who ruled from that brilliant city with its great lighthouse and its great library, until the very last of them, the famous and brilliant Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, who bound her fate to the great men of Rome, to Caesar and to Antony, in a doomed attempt to save her ancient kingdom, and who chose death by the royal serpent rather than be led in chains through Rome, and whose passing brought the 4,000-year line of the pharaohs at last to its end, as Egypt became a province of Rome. And yet even then the civilization would not truly die, for its forms lingered on for centuries under Rome, and though at last the old religion grew quiet, and the meaning of the hieroglyphs was forgotten for more than 1,000 years, in our own age the Rosetta Stone gave the silent stones their voices back, and Champollion cracked the ancient code, and all the long mute walls began to speak again, and Egypt, the civilization that refused to die, came back to life in the memory of the whole world, its treasures in every museum, its story known to every child, its pyramids still standing, its golden mask still gazing out, refusing, after all these thousands of years, ever to be forgotten. That is the whole story then, gathered together, from the first villagers in the mud to the last queen and her serpent and the stones that spoke again. Let it settle over you now, complete, a whole world held gently in the mind as sleep draws near. You do not need to hold on to any of it. You may let it all go now, let it drift and blur and fade into warm colours and soft light. You have travelled the whole length of the river of time tonight, and now you may rest. So let us return now at the very end of our long journey to where we began, to the river. For the river is still there tonight, as it has been for all these thousands upon thousands of years. The Nile still flows, from the far highlands of Africa, north through the long green valley to the wide delta and the sea. Though the great dam that people built in modern times has tamed the ancient flood at last, so that the waters no longer spill each year across the fields as they did for all those centuries, still the river flows, still the sun rises each morning over the eastern cliffs, still it sets each evening into the western desert, into the land of the dead, exactly as it did when the very first villagers watched it from the mud beside the water 10,000 years ago. The pharaohs are gone, the empires are dust, but the river remains, patient and eternal, flowing on through the night, and the pyramids stand silent upon their plateau under the same stars that the pyramid builders watched, and somewhere out on the dark water a small boat drifts, its single lamp glowing, as such boats have drifted for 4,000 years, and the reeds whisper along the bank, and the warm night air moves gently over the land, and all is quiet, and all is peaceful, and all is well. And now it is time for you too to drift. You have come so far tonight, all the way down the long river of the centuries, from the first villages in the mud to the golden mask of the boy king to the last queen, and her serpent and the silent stones that spoke again. It has been a long journey, and you have travelled it well, and now there is nothing more to do, nowhere more to go, there is only rest. So let the story settle over you like fine silt after the flood, like a soft blanket, like the warm darkness itself. Let the names and the kings and the temples grow dim and gentle in your mind, no longer things to remember but only warm colours, soft gold and deep blue and the green of the river and the tawny gold of the desert cliffs, drifting and blending and fading. Let your breathing grow slow and deep and even, in and out, like the tide of the river, like the rise and fall of the flood, like the great slow rhythm of Egypt itself, rising and falling and rising again across the ages. Feel the weight of your body, held and safe. Feel the warmth around you. There is nothing you need to do now. There is nothing you need to think about now. The pharaohs are sleeping in their hidden valley, and the pyramids are keeping their long watch under the stars, and the river is flowing on through the darkness, patient and eternal, and you may let go now, completely, and follow them down into sleep. Let your thoughts grow slower now and softer, and further apart, like the last few boats drifting home across the darkening water. There is no need to hold on to anything. If a name comes back to you, Khufu, or Isis, or Tutankhamun, or Cleopatra, let it drift by like a leaf on the current, and let it go. If an image returns, the golden mask, or the great columns of Karnak with the light falling between them, or the 4 stone giants gazing out across the river at Abu Simbel, let it soften and blur and fade into the warm darkness. You do not need to keep any of it. It will all still be here, the whole long story, whenever you wish to return to it. But for now, you may set it all down and rest. Imagine, if it soothes you, that you are lying in a small boat upon the calm, dark surface of the Nile, drifting slowly downstream under a sky thick with stars. The boat rocks ever so gently beneath you, the softest, slowest rocking, and the warm night air moves over you like a caress, and the water murmurs quietly against the hull, and the reeds whisper along the banks as you pass. And there is nothing to do, nowhere to go, only to lie there and drift, held safe upon the ancient river, carried gently along by the same slow current that has flowed here for 10,000 years, and for 10,000 years before that. Drifting, drifting, the stars turning slowly overhead, the warm dark all around you, and sleep coming softly, like the gentlest of tides, rising to carry you away. Rest now. Breathe slowly. Let the river carry you. Let the warm darkness hold you. The civilization that refused to die has told you its whole long story, from the very beginning to the very end, and now it fades gently away, and there is only the quiet, and the warmth, and the slow deep peace of the coming sleep. Sleep now. Drift now. The Nile flows on, and the stars keep watch, and you are safe, and you are warm, and all is well, all is well, all is well. Good night, sleep deeply, sleep well, and may your own heart, when it is weighed, be as light as a feather.